Join us for the Career and Technical Education event of the year. ACTE's Career Tech Vision happens this November 29th through December 2nd in Phoenix, Arizona, and is the largest annual conference in the nation for CTE educators, business leaders, and industry professionals. Last year, the event attracted more than 6,000 attendees. At Vision, you'll forge meaningful professional connections with educators and industry leaders. You'll expand your professional development in hundreds of concurrent sessions, workshops, and tours, and learn from innovative keynote speakers and leaders on the Vision main stage. I'll be at the Career Tech Expo, checking out the hundreds of exhibits, workshops, and live demonstrations, and in the Career Pavilion, learning about high-demand careers and the learning systems that prepare our students for them. Don't miss the ACT Awards Gala, where we'll celebrate the enormous contributions of our CTE educators. Choose to attend in person or remotely. For all the information on this terrific event, visit careertechvision.com. Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Well, welcome into the Tech Ed Podcast. I am your host, Matt Kirkner, and I can't tell you how excited we are for the incredible innovation that is happening these days in the world of advanced manufacturing, what some might call smart manufacturing, where we are able to gather so much data, acquire so much data in so many creative ways, and then use that data to improve manufacturing process for customers, for production, in the back of the office, and so on, in so many fashions that we've never been able to do before. It is probably, in fact, unbelievably, the most exciting time for us to ever be in the world of advanced manufacturing. Our guest today is somebody who lives in that world every day, somebody who is talking to innovators, who is helping facilitate innovation, who is getting people excited about this world of advanced manufacturing. We are so excited to welcome back to the Tech Ed Podcast the Chief Executive Officer of CESMII, the Smart Manufacturing Institute. His name is John Dyck. And John, thank you so much for coming back on.
Matt, it's truly an honor to be with you again.
You're doing so many interesting things, and you can't really help but go on LinkedIn, go on social media, hear something about the great work that CESMII is doing. Of course, one of the great manufacturing institutes here in the United States, but I would say in a lot of ways leading the other institutes into this world of smart manufacturing. You and a couple others have really gotten in front of this and are doing some great things. I'm so excited to talk about that. I want to start by talking about an event that I know you held just recently, and that was your annual meeting at South Tech. And I'm certain that some of our listeners were present for that event and had an opportunity to see all the great things. But for those who weren't, tell us a little bit about what happened at South Tech.
Yeah, we had a fantastic annual member meeting, which is obviously broader than just our members, but we have the opportunity there to kind of recap a great year, recap kind of what we've accomplished looking back, and then obviously set the expectations, set the stage for where we're focused going forward. And I agree completely with you that this is certainly in my career, which, as you can tell, I'm not new to this game. In my career, this is the most exciting and the most important moment in manufacturing history from my perspective. And the fact that manufacturing, specifically smart manufacturing, is on the lips of and on the minds of manufacturing executives of at a level I've never seen before. This is I think real testimony to what's happening on a global stage, and the dawning recognition that manufacturing is a strategic enabler for our competitiveness as a nation and our well-being as a nation. And so it's gratifying to be here. It was gratifying to see our members show up in full force at South Tech. So South Tech, as you know, is led and managed by SME, the Society of Manufacturing Engineers. We were able to co-locate our annual member meeting with that event and actually add the kind of dimension of the smart manufacturing experience to that event. And so we hosted a number of workshops there, both in terms of workforce development, in terms of smart manufacturing business assessment, in terms of smart manufacturing architectures and technology development, and of course a deep dive look at how smart manufacturing investment, how the investment that CESMII has made here in this country has advanced the state of the art of smart manufacturing broadly, and the whole idea of innovation in this space to help manufacturers become more competitive. So I'm sure we'll talk about more of those things, Matt. But it was an exciting time. We had a great showing. We had a great venue. It was great to partner with SME in this important way, and it was just gratifying in every way.
And credit for that huge investment that CESMII is making in the future of smart manufacturing. And I know it's got to be just fascinating for you to be right in the middle of all these advancements. And to your point, we are going to get into that in detail today. It feels like, John, if you kind of turn the clock back maybe 5 years ago, people like you and me and certainly many others felt like we were evangelizing for smart manufacturing or Industry 4.0. Here's what's coming. Get ready for it. It's going to revolutionize manufacturing. Nothing is going to be the same. And it really does feel to me like now we're well into that. And we've taken a world of advanced manufacturing from large OEMs and Fortune 500 companies to even the small to mid-sized businesses that were maybe a little bit slower to pick up on some of these trends in some cases. Now everybody's talking about it. Everybody has an appreciation for it. I think everybody has an understanding that smart technology and our ability to gather information across an entire platform, not just from one company, but from thousands, and then use technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze that data, find patterns, find trends, predict the future. If we don't like the future, fix a problem before it ever happens. I mean, we're living through this now, and this isn't something that's 5 or 10 years in the future. And I know you realize that as well, that we're right in the middle of Industry 4.0, right in the middle of smart manufacturing. And to that point, I would love to hear a little bit about the trends that you are hearing about and the trends that you are seeing, John, in smart manufacturing. So maybe, what are 3 big takeaways from South Tech and from what you're seeing that our audience should be aware of?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think there is an unprecedented view today that says the workforce that we've counted on in the past is not the workforce that we have today. I heard some remarkable statistics from the dialogues that we had there and some of the workshops that we had with our manufacturing members, that as few as 5 years ago, the average age of the frontline workforce in this one Fortune 100 company was over 20 years. Today, it's less than 2 years. An unbelievable shift. This is not catching anyone by surprise, but at the same time, it is catching us by surprise in the sense that we haven't done much to prepare for this. And there's just such a dramatic implication of that. And so what used to be kind of an HR and maybe a leadership issue has very quickly become a smart manufacturing issue. What can we do to train the people that are much, much newer, have much less experience, are perhaps a little less reliable on the shop floor than they were in the past? What can we do to equip those people much more quickly? And then what can we do to retain them, to make their work more exciting, to take the dull and dangerous and dirty components out of that work and turn it into exciting and compelling and meaningful work? So I would say that's a year ago, that was on its way, but it's now a full force initiative that has to be dealt with. So number 2, I would say, is equally strategic is the recognition that as I alluded to already, that data engineering, data architectures have to evolve from the data silos and stovepipe architectures that we've created without exception up to this point, and that the future has to look different, that we have to invest more in terms of how we architect strategies, manufacturing data contextualization infrastructure, and enable a much more low-cost, much less complex way of developing, implementing, and sustaining value-creating apps on the shop floor. And then last but not least, kind of all of this comes together around something we've been talking about for 20 years as well, which is the convergence of OT and IT, and something that, despite our best efforts, we haven't been very effective at. And I think it's at the nexus of all of these issues, particularly from a people and an ecosystem perspective, where we have continued to see the separation of an enterprise sort of ecosystem and a plant level ecosystem, and that has to change as we think about these strategies for the future. So I would say that's the probably not short enough, but that's the short perspective on some of the most important trends that we're seeing in this space.
You mentioned three things. You mentioned the workforce, you mentioned data acquisition and the use of data, and you mentioned the IT/OT convergence. If we start with the workforce one, first of all, I agree with you. None of this is a surprise. In fact, I can remember sitting in rooms of CEOs literally 20 plus years ago talking about the football through the fire hose, the baby boomers were going to retire, we were going to get to 2020, and we were going to have all of our talent walking out the door. We all knew what was going to happen. We all talked about it. Most of us did very little to be able to fend that off. It was a problem for another day. And now here we are with that incredible lack of skilled talent. Can you point to a couple of things that you think are really working in terms of how we upskill that next generation of particularly the incumbent workers? So you started your answer with talking about the workforce that's in place now that has a certain level of experience, that is certainly, almost an order of magnitude. In fact, by your numbers, an order of magnitude less than what walked out the door over the course of the last 5 years. How do we attack the challenge of upskilling the incumbent worker that's already in manufacturing at a time when manufacturing technology is changing as quickly as it is?
That's the $1 million question, Matt. And I think
indeed billion, maybe
billion
right.
Beyond that, right? Put a few zeros on that,
right?
Because frankly, we're talking about, and we are seeing the beginning of the reshoring of manufacturing and friendshoring of manufacturing and the regionalization of supply chains, which is putting enormous stress on just the sheer availability of workers already. There are over 2 million job openings that we anticipate over the next few years. There's almost 1 million open right now, just in the US. We have a massive, massive challenge in front of us. And so I think there's some cultural things that have to be done and that are being done at a family unit level. Help parents understand that manufacturing is and can be a very successful way for your children to grow up and to aspire to be in a manufacturing environment going forward. I think that's something we're seeing tackled now for the first time in a couple of generations. I don't think for many of us 20 years ago, 30 years ago, our parents were saying, we want you to be in manufacturing. It's an exciting and compelling place to be. In fact, for many of us, it was just the opposite. So I think that's something that we're seeing tackled for the first time. I would also want to pay tribute to the funding agency for CESMII, which is the Department of Energy, which through the commissioning of Congress has kicked off a really important work this year to create a national plan for smart manufacturing, to raise the visibility of these important needs, how the workforce can be empowered and enabled, how we can attract more workers into the space, to raise that to a national dialogue in a much more visible way. And frankly, that I'll just double click on that for a moment to say that as a nation, we're a nation of individuals that are individualistic, much more so than I think any other nation on this planet. And that spilled over into our corporate DNA as well. We're very individualistic as corporations. And this notion of collaboration is not something that is part of our DNA. It's very much so a part of the German manufacturing DNA or the French or Spanish manufacturing DNA. It's not part of ours. And the more global manufacturing has become, the more important this has become to us here. There's much goodness around the way manufacturing innovation has happened by individuals and corporations here in this nation. But there are important things that can't be solved as individuals. And I think this notion of how we raise the tide around the value of the workforce in manufacturing, that's one of those. I think there's a natural elevation of the importance and probably the value of the worker when we have this conversation at a national level. And so I think that's a really, really important piece. And I would be remiss not to address the fact that the technical debt that we've created for ourselves over the last 30 years isn't something that just goes away overnight, and fundamentally needs to be a part of how we think about equipping the workforce of the future. The back to those data silos and the fact that for a worker to be equipped and to have sort of the technology around them to augment their ability to be part of the value creation and the innovation process on the front line, that is fundamentally constrained today based on that technical debt that we have. And so I think it's really important for us to be much more thoughtful about how we architect solutions that can bring maintenance data and real-time machine data and AI machine learning and a broader perspective from the people behind me that can support me, that have dealt with this problem in the past, and that can encourage and help me through this. Even though I don't have the domain expertise to solve that problem, I can solve it if I've got the right sort of tools around me. And so all of that, I think, is a function of a much more holistic approach and a much more strategic engagement of the frontline worker to help address this challenge, which is absolutely essential. If we don't, I don't want to be too dramatic or bleak, but it's something we have to address.
And, it's an existential threat, for lack of a better term. It's at the very core of our continued existence as a country and our continued success here in the United States of America. We've talked a lot already today about how supply chains have changed. We mentioned on the Tech Ed podcast quite frequently that when people could get what they want, when they want it, at a price they were willing to pay for it, it was really easy to take manufacturing, and particularly advanced manufacturing, for granted. Now we're starting to realize that our supply chains are moving much closer to the point of consumption, and we may not have the technical expertise, or for that matter, the infrastructure to be able to respond to that demand in the way that we want to. I think if you just look at what's happened in the whole world of integrated circuits and ICs and chips and so on, that's been a perfect example, or at least a really good example. You've used the term technical debt a couple times, John. I would love for you to expound on that a little bit. Are we talking about workforce skills? Are we talking about technology? Are we talking about infrastructure? What would you include in that definition?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a really important question. We always talk about the fact that it's about people, process, and technologies, and that transformation of any sort is going to require a holistic approach for all three of those. And I want to pay service to the fact that innovation has never been an issue in this space. We've empowered people with amazing technology that's enabled them to solve just about any problem that we throw at them. In fact, HMI SCADA, I think, was the first and perhaps the last major wave of innovation where we took something that had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and put it in the hands of the average engineer for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, and allowed them to equip the people and the worker with the tools, the data, the visualization they needed to solve problems on the shop floor and to drive efficiency and productivity on the shop floor. One of the interesting byproducts of that is when we did that really 25 years ago, mid 90s, so almost 30 years ago, we equipped these people to essentially be heroes, which was a great thing, but it was the beginning of a wave of what I called unbridled innovation. Innovation with very little structure, one use case at a time, which created data silos everywhere. Data silos that, for the most part, the OT community didn't know how to sustain, didn't know how to move forward. There's way too much Windows DOS, Windows 3.1, Windows 95, Windows NT on shop floors all over the nation. All of these data silos that are a huge risk from a cybersecurity standpoint. They're a huge risk in terms of Fred and Bob and Sue, who built them and are probably retired or about to retire. And yet they're mission critical, right? So I'll call it this mess that we've created has been a mess driven by innovation, one use case at a time, without, and there was no malicious intent. There was no OT-centric way to sort of wrap these unbridled innovation activities into a more structured, strategic approach. IT has done that, by the way. As you'll know, IT is an enterprise. It's I hate to use that word twice in a row, but it was the intentional use. It's an enterprise initiative. It's funded and driven into the operation from an enterprise perspective, top-down perspective. OT is inherently plant-centric and use case-centric. And so, again, to the point we made before, the blending of those two worlds, not that OT works at the pace of IT, there are inherent differences, but we have to create more structure. And I think the technologies here today, this is what interoperability and openness and crowdsourcing and open sourcing can do for us in a careful, managed way, bring these capabilities to the shop floor so that we don't have to propagate that one use case at a time, one data silo at a time mentality to how we solve problems and innovate on the shop floor.
So let's go a little deeper on that. And as much as you mentioned three trends, the first one being workforce, the second one being data acquisition, how we use data. And I agree with you. I go in and out of plants that you still see, Unix systems that were implemented 30 years ago that are being used to process orders and produce travelers on the shop floor and so on. And it's crazy how in some ways every other aspect of technology is advanced, but given some of the fear that goes along with making a huge investment in operational software transformation and so on, and having the right resources to do it, and being worried about the risks of what happens as we're going through that. And those are all decisions that I've made in manufacturing for 25, 30 years. I get why people are hesitant, but you're right. Now we've got all these disparate systems operating on shop floors all over the United States. I think one of the great strengths of US manufacturing is the fact that we have so many small to mid-sized manufacturers that are innovating in that space. We've had guests on our podcast, such as Azatash Padi from McKinsey, who talks about the incredible innovation that happens because of that. But yet the risk is all of this disparate data and these different systems. So share with us a little bit of your vision of how do we solve for that? If we recognize we have that problem, what does the solution to that look like?
There's obviously a knowledge and an education component around all of this, and we've been investing a tremendous amount to bring that sort of level of knowledge up for both the vendor communities, but even more importantly for the manufacturers. And what we're seeing is that there's a growing insistence by manufacturers to say that this proprietary legacy stovepipe architecture, data siloed approach is no longer sufficient. In fact, the most mature and the most sophisticated manufacturers in the world here in the US are moving away from actually buying software tools from the vendor ecosystem because of that reality right there. The fact that there is a reluctance to move beyond those proprietary architectures to a more open, interoperable set of approaches and architectures. And so what we've been doing from a CESMII perspective is advocating for this notion of interoperability. I think fundamentally, the large manufacturers have deep enough pockets to do whatever it takes at whatever cost, even though it's much too costly and complex for them, and inhibiting their ability to be more productive. But there's a growing digital gap between those, call them the Fortune 1000, and the small, medium manufacturing community that will only be closed if we can reduce cost and complexity. We use the word democratization of smart manufacturing, accessibility by reducing cost and complexity. And so there's a series of steps that we believe have to take place, but it comes down to the fact that that the way we contextualize data ought to be pre-competitive, ought to be open and interoperable, and it should not be the domain of every software vendor to have to build that stovepipe for themselves for every single product. Let's break it down into the most simple structure. This notion, for example, that you've got a mechanical stamping press, and no matter whose product you buy to collect data from that stamping press to make it more efficient as part of a larger stamping line, no matter whose product you buy today, you have to buy or own the domain expertise to say, out of the millions of data points in the automation systems that are feeding this press, that are controlling this press, and that are unloading this press, here are the 200 data points that I need to extract, and here's how I want to contextualize those 200 data points, and here's the math I want to do on those 200 data points to provide my mean time between failure, my overall equipment effectiveness. Here's how I connect my product flow from these rolls of steel into the stamping press, and so I can do my traceability and genealogy from finished goods all the way back through my steel suppliers. Every systems integrator or engineer has to develop that contextualization model from scratch every single time in every product, in every technology stack. There is no way of sharing that today. So we believe that fundamentally, if we can crowdsource the creation of that information model, get it 95% right for everyone, and then give you that data model, information model rather, and then give you the tools to extend it so that 5% tweaking for me and for my organization, I can do quickly and simply using very simple free tools. And by the way, I can take that, the thing that I've now extended and actually put that back in the marketplace for everyone else to use, or I can keep that as my secret sauce. But the whole point is, for that asset now, no one anywhere in the world ever has to buy and pay for the domain expertise to collect data from that machine ever, that type of machine ever again, right? And so we, like I said, we've got hundreds and hundreds, over 700 machine builders, manufacturers, vendors working together to build these information models right now. We have hundreds available in our marketplace, including some core, we think about them as Lego blocks, right? These information models are Lego blocks that can be built on each other to build a process. Start with an asset, build a complex set of assets or line, and then of course the process around that, like I said, how the material and the people fit into that process or into that piece of equipment. All of that is a function of standardized information models that we are now enabling as a free resource for anyone. And that's how you reduce cost and complexity. That's how you enable the interoperability. And now think about that at the supply chain level, the opportunity to standardize how information about a specific business process or manufacturing process can be exchanged in a standards-based way so that it's not vendor-centric or specific to any one manufacturer.
That example, I think, really drives it home. So now if I'm a vice president of operations, I'm somebody who's leading a digital transformation from the operations side and inside a small to mid-sized manufacturer. I guess it doesn't matter necessarily the size of the manufacturer. I'm in that position. You touched on your third trend, which is the convergence of IT and OT, and talked a little bit about how in some ways IT is ahead of OT in terms of the democratization of software and data and process and so on. So if I'm that person, I'm that vice president of operations, what's my first and my second step in terms of starting down this journey as we try to create more access to data and make it simpler for us to gather data and then analyze and figure out what it's telling us?
So I love that question. The typical approach today, and I wouldn't advocate anything differently, is for that executive to say, we need to develop a strategy to ensure that as an organization, we're advancing our capabilities in step with our competition. And so we can drive the sort of productivity goals and initiatives that we need to going forward for our strategic advancement. My big push right now is that up until this point, what happens is those individuals that are responsible for going to develop that strategy are being educated by vendors. And fundamentally, that's where we've been as an ecosystem because this thing is so new and there hasn't been a body of and depth of knowledge in this space. We're here to say that we as a consortia focused on this have a massive knowledge base of materials that we can use to equip you to demand sort of a next generation approach to solve these problems. So you're not going to be propagating the same technical debt and the same complexities that we've kind of naturally evolved to up to this point, that you are expecting more from the vendors in this space, that you're expecting more from the partners in this space, and fundamentally that you're part of this future-proof approach to developing your manufacturing strategy. Matt, I've been shocked at how many manufacturers have a business strategy, but they don't have a clear, relevant, contemporary manufacturing strategy. And I'm talking more than just the sort of Toyota production system and that sort of equivalent. I'm talking about how does our corporate strategy align with the things that we're doing and the way we're investing in the plant floor. And obviously, smart manufacturing would be a massive enabler for those in that process. And so, actually, part of our executive council work this year was to form a strategic initiative around a smart manufacturing playbook. And the executive council identified 8 specific roles, starting with corporate manufacturing leadership, plant leadership, frontline workers, and then of course the ecosystem, the systems integrators, the vendors, the machine builders, the learning system. So this playbook will address all 8 of those roles in a very intentional way to help advocate for the ideas that will raise the tide and help manufacturers of all sizes, small, medium, and large, to formulate a much more systematic strategy. As part of this playbook, we're introducing, and we have been investing this year in advocating the idea of a smart manufacturing mindset. So Matt, you were around like I was 35 years ago when quality became part of our DNA, when safety became part of our DNA, continuous improvement became part of our DNA. It's just an accepted way of doing things. Do we do it perfectly? No, but nobody questions that quality, safety, continuous improvement are at the core of how we accomplish our manufacturing objectives. We believe, and this is what our executive council believes, that a smart manufacturing mindset has to become part of our DNA as well, in the same way that we have to be thinking about how we can digitally enable our workers, expect a data-driven response for our continuous improvement strategies. By the way, there's a huge disconnect. We did a survey just last month, and we found a huge disconnect between the continuous improvement lean part of the world and the rest of manufacturing operations. Lean and continuous improvement still wants nothing to do with digital. Some organizations do, but there's a massive preponderance that say we don't need digital. I think any organization that still thinks that way will not be here 10 years from now. Digital and lean need to be synonymous. We have to work together to bring that community into this era of digitization, or we're going to be stuck where we are today, and that's not a good place to be.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, we talk a lot about this whole idea that, whether we want to call it smart manufacturing, Industry 4.0, digital transformation, digital technology, I look at those as lean tools in the same way that we would look at Poke-Yoke or we would look at 5S as a tool for improving process. Digitization is probably the most important tool in history for improving manufacturing processes. And you and I are 100% aligned. I mean, the organizations that don't figure this out and figure it out quickly are going to be quickly left behind, in the same way, to your example, that companies that didn't figure out standardized quality or safety, for that matter, when we were going through ISO and QS and TS and doing what we say and saying what we do and creating work instructions and standard work and repeatable process. The companies that didn't do that, the manufacturers that didn't do that, got left in the dust. And then the next big wave that came along, again, to your point, was continuous improvement, Kaizen, employee engagement, driving waste out of systems. All of a sudden, if you're doing that, you're driving more margin into your business. You can reinvest in the company as you can, and you can compete on price when you have to. And so those companies gapped everybody. And if you missed both of those, you're probably out of business today. And so you and I agree, if you missed the digitization wave that is coming at us, and I would argue has already overcome us, and we're in the middle of it, you're in big trouble. We've got to really make sure that our companies are adopting these technologies, manufacturers are adopting these technologies. And to me, it really is kind of to use another lean term, the Hoshinkanri of manufacturing, the whole idea that we want to align, again, to your point, the business practices in the organization with the manufacturing practices, and we can't do one without the other. Those have to be inextricably linked, and digitization allows us to do that. That's going to be so incredibly important as we move forward as a nation into this new age of manufacturing, into this new age of onshoring and reshoring, and again, manufacturing being closer to the point of consumption. But we also have to remember that we don't exist in a bubble, that the United States is still part of a global manufacturing ecosystem. And I know you're taking steps along those lines as well, John, specifically recently joining a strategic group of manufacturing nations to form what's called the International Manufacturing X Council. In this global competitive marketplace that we're in now, tell us a little bit about what that organization is going to do and how CESMII is partnering in that particular case.
I believe this is one of the most strategic things that we need to be focused on as a nation, and really as a group of manufacturing regions around the world. We've been working closely with Germany and Japan for a couple of years now to ensure that our efforts around workforce development, standards advocacy, and interoperability are harmonized. We've been very, very intentional to ensure that specifically amongst these three regions, as three really important manufacturing regions, that we're at the very least doing no harm, but then finding, I think, to our delight, that we're so aligned in our approaches around interoperability and standards that we've been able to develop full technical alignment around our interoperability strategy. So that's the foundation that we've laid over the last 3 years with Germany and then Japan. That allowed us to get together this summer in Brussels to say, we believe that the notion coming out of the pandemic and seeing how disconnected manufacturers are from their suppliers and how they're still fundamentally, and most people won't believe this unless you're in this space, relying on faxes, phone calls, and emails when it comes to understanding where my suppliers are and the sort of unreliability of forecasting. And so looking at that, saying, all right, manufacturing is global. We need manufacturers and their suppliers to have standards-based ways to exchange information without requiring a human being in the mix. But that's not a national thing. That inevitably has to be an international thing. And so this notion of manufacturing data spaces, interoperability, as an extension to the work that we've already done sort of at the plant and enterprise level, that's the next frontier. And as I said, has a massive value multiplier if we can get this figured out. So we agreed together with Germany, France, Austria, Spain, Australia, Japan, Korea, Canada, to 9 nations fundamentally, at least to kick this thing off, with more to come. We agreed to partner together, form this thing called International Manufacturing X, to work on these challenges together, to develop the standards, the approaches, the trust frameworks, the policies, all of the things that are necessary for whether it's one American manufacturer exchanging data with 50, 500 US-based suppliers, or whether those suppliers are somewhere else in the world. We have to be able to figure this out. So that's the charter of this group. We're excited to be part of the founding members of this new organization, and we're going to solve this problem. This is something that we have to tackle together as an ecosystem, and I think is a great example of how collaboration with other like-minded manufacturing organizations, individuals, organizations, and regions will help us solve some of these major challenges.
It's an important initiative indeed. Our audience certainly will recognize that I do my share of board work in manufacturing, work in private equity, and portfolio companies of some of those private equity groups that we're engaged with, and own a couple manufacturing related companies as well. And one of the companies that we're working with actually, just, and this is for our audience benefit, is at a point now where it's predicting cash flow 14 months in advance with a 4% plus or minus accuracy. So you think about being able to know in January of 2025 how an organization is going to perform. And they're doing that by doing so many of the things at a micro level that you're talking about here today, John, knowing about, what orders are in process, what customers are likely to order, when they're likely to order, what the lead times on specific products are, and then understanding, the production cycle and when those orders are going to ship, and then the payment experience of the specific customer to whom that order is going to ship, and gathering all of that data and analyzing it with all kinds of historical data building up over the course of time to be able to produce cash flow projections plus or minus 4%, 14 months in advance. And then you think about all the opportunities that creates in the business itself, to take on risk, to understand cash flow, to understand when we're going to hire, who we're going to invest in, those types of things. And what I hear you saying is really doing that at scale, and understanding, if we can understand availability of raw materials, if we can understand lead times of raw materials, and we can understand customer order process and all of these other things, we can now identify the long pole in the tent from a lead time standpoint, and use this predictive data to really drive a ton of waste out of the supply chain, not just domestically, but around the globe. Am I kind of understanding that right? Are we talking about the same thing?
We're talking about exactly the same thing in real time with no human beings in the mix, allows systems to talk to each other between manufacturers and suppliers. And now double click on one of those items, Matt, the idea that order is going to ship. And oh, by the way, aside from a paper or digital COA, certificate of authentication, you now have the exact quality parameters of that train load of flour, or that active pharmaceutical ingredient batch, or that roll of steel, the carbon footprint, and the exact recipe parameters, quality parameters that allow then, wherever that a train load car of flour ends up in a General Mills Cheerios plant, allows me to now adjust my recipe and my machine setup, process setup parameters specific to that batch, knowing that it's passed all the quality requirements, but it's at this end of the humidity spectrum versus that end of the humidity spectrum, allows me to create a much more reliable and a high quality product on my side, right? Not to mention the idea of genealogy and traceability from farm to fork, if you will. All of that
Absolutely.
part of this notion of a real-time supply chain data exchange.
I was just going to use the same word, real time. I think about lot control in the manufacturing world that I grew up in, John, and we had it, right? I mean, you could drive information back to raw materials and understand the source of the materials, but sometimes if you got a corrective action request, for instance, from a large manufacturer that wanted to understand why there was a quality issue, it could take days and weeks to drive back to what was the original root cause of the source of that problem. Which all the while you're building inventory and you're investing in new materials that may or may not be compliant. And now you've got the ability to do that, and not just in real time, but in a predictive fashion as well. So looking into the future and even predicting some of those quality issues and visualizing them, and then understanding how we can avoid them in the process. It's such an exciting time to be in manufacturing. I think about data acquisition, data visualization, how we're sharing information in the fashions that you're describing today. I had the pleasure of participating along with one of your colleagues, Conrad Leva, a few weeks back at Rockwell Automation. And so we partnered with Rockwell. We partnered with the Smart Automation Certification Alliance, folks like Jim Wall. I think people know that I serve on the national board of that organization as well, to really think about what are the standards that we need to be considering as we think about acquiring data, sharing data, visualizing data. I know that led to a really great partnership between CESMII and the Smart Automation Certification Alliance and others. Tell us a little bit about that partnership and what's going on there.
Yeah, I couldn't be more excited and pleased at the way all of this is coming together, right? We talked about data engineering and data rigor and process rigor and bringing some of the sort of best practices from other domains into the OT world. From my perspective, this notion of micro-credentialing and working with SACA and great organizations like Rockwell to bring standardized approaches to these domains is absolutely key. We have to bring these micro credentials into this sort of manufacturing operations space, and SACA has been at the front end of the tip of the spear for all of us. So around smart manufacturing fundamentals, we've been able to fund the development of some of these credentials, right? Around smart manufacturing fundamentals, around smart manufacturing data acquisition, visualization and analytics, and data transmission and cybersecurity, and multiple additional ones in the queue right now that we're working on with SACA and with some other great organizations. From my perspective, this is a vital part of the value chain of how data can be used to create value, and it starts at that level with the trades, with the community colleges, with the engineering schools, and then of course the frontline workers themselves in the manufacturing organizations themselves can be brought into this sort of structured approach to how they're upskilled and how they're educated. So I'm thrilled at the progress that they're making, and it's a privilege to be part of this ecosystem that's focusing on these great things.
And in the end, it really is about those frontline workers and the individuals that are creating manufacturing output, creating the products that we're selling all over the globe, and keeping the focus on what skills and competencies are necessary for them to be successful in this new world of smart manufacturing. And really listening to employers, listening to the organizations that are right in the middle of digital transformations, and asking them, when you are, whether it's acquiring data, whether it's analyzing data, whether it's protecting it, whether it's using it to predict future outcomes and to modify process in order to maximize productivity, for example, in manufacturing, really keeping the focus on what is it that they are looking at and looking for. And in as much as I was part of this great technical work group there, where SACA was conducting interviews with all of these employers, Fortune 500 companies and small to mid-sized manufacturers alike, and really getting a sense from them of what it is that they're looking for in the next generation of manufacturing talent. It really is all about alignment. It's about collaboration. It's about problem solving. And that's where amazing things can happen. That's where incredible things can happen. CESMII continuing to do incredible things in that regard. And we are almost up against the back end of our conversation here today, John, but I did want to pose one final question to you. It's a question we love asking our guests here on the Tech Ed podcast. We love hearing the answers even more than asking the question. And the question is this: if you were to go back in time to that 15-year-old John Dyck, and if you could give him one piece of advice, what would that piece of advice be?
That's such a powerful question, and one that I want to answer thoughtfully. I recall back then, and in the immediate sort of decade that followed my 15-year-old self, that public speaking was the bane of my existence. Every time in school we were asked to do a speech or introduce ourselves in a meeting somewhere, my palms would be sweating, and I would be absolutely filled with anxiety at the notion of just publicly stating who I was and what I was trying to accomplish in that space. And I made career decisions right straight out of college about the kind of work that I would be doing based on how much public speaking it involved or didn't involve. And so I think the advice I would give myself is face your fears, John. Face your fears and figure this out, and not just how to communicate effectively, but sort of the nuances around. Are people really asking this question? What's the question behind the question? What are they really looking for? So just the sort of strategic import or importance of communicating, right? That's not novel, but that was one of my personal fears that's driven parts of my career that, looking back, I think would have been different in many ways. I'm grateful for where I am today and how I got where I got, but that's what I would tell my 15-year-old self.
Well, and it may not be novel to you. I can tell you that's the first time that somebody on this Tech Ed podcast, as we've asked that same question to well over 100 guests, has given the answer about, face your fear, specifically with regard to public speaking. You've certainly gotten past that. We've had a great conversation here today. This episode will be listened to by thousands and thousands, and your voice will be in front of all those individuals. So certainly you've gotten past that fear, but that great advice about in the same way that we face the truth, facing those fears, recognizing them, finding ways to overcome them, because they can certainly constrain whatever the future looks like. I think the future is bright for smart manufacturing. I think it's really bright for CESMII. John, can't thank you enough for your leadership, for your advocacy, all the great things that your institution and all of your partners are doing. And we really appreciate you spending time with us on the Tech Ed podcast.
It's been a real pleasure chatting with you, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you like this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.